We had been married for over 10 years. A decade filled with anniversaries, birthdays, and all the little memories that come from building a life together. From the outside, we had what most would call a good life. A cozy home in a quiet neighborhood, steady careers, and a bright, curious little girl, Emily, who was the center of our universe. When people saw us at Emily's soccer games or walking our golden retriever, Max, they probably thought, now that's a family that has it all figured out. But if life has taught me anything, it's that appearances can be deceiving. It wasn't always like this. Me sitting alone in our dimly lit kitchen late at night, staring at my wife's empty chair and wondering where it all started to go wrong. I used to believe we were unbreakable, a team that could weather anything. But looking back, the cracks had started to show long before I noticed them. The changes were subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss. She started coming home later from work, her usual cheerful, "I'm home," replaced by tired sighs and mumbled excuses. "Long meeting," she'd say, or "the client needed last-minute changes." I didn't think much of it. We all get busy, right? But then came the work trips, short, spontaneous ones that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. "It's just for a night or two," she'd reassure me, kissing Emily on the forehead before heading out the door. At first, I told myself these were normal things. It was the price of her career, I thought. She worked in marketing, a field full of late-night brainstorming sessions and out-of-town conferences. It made sense. And yet, there was a small voice in the back of my mind whispering that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't just the late nights or the trips, though. Little details began piling up like snowflakes in a storm. She'd started wearing a new perfume, one I didn't recognize. It was subtle, floral, and expensive. Definitely not the brand I'd gifted her last Christmas. Then there were the sudden bursts of happiness when she looked at her phone. She'd glance at the screen, smile in a way that felt intimate, and then quickly lock it when I walked into the room. I told myself it was nothing. Don't be that guy, I thought. You're imagining things. But the doubts clung to me like a second skin. One night, I remember sitting in the living room with Emily while she drew pictures at the coffee table. My wife, Sarah, was in the kitchen, her back turned to us as she texted furiously on her phone. I tried to focus on Emily's drawing, a messy but adorable sketch of Max chasing a ball. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's attention was somewhere far from our home. "Daddy, does Mommy not like playing with us anymore?" Emily asked suddenly, her big brown eyes wide with innocence. The question caught me off guard. "What? Of course she does," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. "She's just really busy with work right now." Emily nodded, but her expression didn't change. She went back to her drawing, and I tried to ignore the guilt gnawing at my chest. It was one thing for me to feel uneasy, but for Emily to notice? That stung. The turning point came on an otherwise ordinary Thursday evening. Sarah had fallen asleep on the couch after dinner, her phone resting precariously on the armrest. I knew it was wrong, but curiosity got the better of me. I reached for her phone, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. What I found changed everything. There, nestled between mundane work emails and family group texts, was a message from a contact I didn't recognize. A man's name. The words were casual at first glance, nothing overtly suspicious, but there was a tone to them, a familiarity that made my stomach churn. "Can't wait to see you again," the message read, followed by a winking emoji. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Was this a joke? A misunderstanding? I scrolled through their chat, searching for some innocent explanation. But the further I went, the harder it became to ignore the truth staring back at me. I didn't say anything that night. I sat in silence, staring at the screen until her phone buzzed in my hand, snapping me back to reality. Sarah stirred on the couch, mumbling something in her sleep. I put the phone back where I found it, my heart pounding in my chest. That night, lying in bed beside her, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the words over and over like a broken record. "Can't wait to see you again." My wife, my Sarah, the mother of my child. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront her? Pretend I hadn't seen anything? Was I overreacting? But deep down, I knew the answer. This wasn't nothing. Something was happening, and it was only a matter of time before it shattered the life we'd built together. As I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic sound of her breathing, I made a promise to myself. I would find out the truth, no matter what it took. When I finally confronted her about the messages, I expected anger, denial, maybe even tears. What I didn't expect was how calm she was. It was a quiet Saturday morning. Emily was at her friend's house for a sleepover, and Sarah was sipping her coffee at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone as if the world hadn't just collapsed around us. I sat down across from her, my stomach in knots, and simply asked, "Who's Mark?" Her head shot up, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second before she composed herself. "Mark? Oh, he's just a colleague," she said with a light shrug, as if I'd asked her about the weather. "Why?" I placed my hands flat on the table to steady myself. "I saw the messages," I said, my voice low but firm. "The ones where he says he can't wait to see you again." For a moment, the kitchen felt impossibly still. Then, she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as if I were a child accusing her of stealing cookies. "Oh, that's just Mark being Mark. He's like that with everyone. It's harmless." The dismissiveness in her tone made my blood boil. "Harmless? Sarah, this doesn't feel harmless. The way he talks to you, the way you smile when you read his messages. None of that feels like nothing." She sighed, setting her coffee down. "You're overthinking this," she said, reaching for my hand across the table. Her touch was warm, familiar, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her. "I swear, there's nothing going on. He's a coworker and we're working on a big project together. That's all. You know how office dynamics are. It's just friendly banter." Friendly banter. The phrase echoed in my mind, bouncing around like a loose screw. "Then why didn't you mention him before? If he's just a coworker, why keep it a secret?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, and I saw a flash of something, irritation, maybe even anger. "I didn't think I needed to report every single colleague I talked to," she said, pulling her hand back. "Do you tell me about every woman you work with? About every text you send? This isn't about me, it's about your insecurities." And just like that, the conversation was over. She stood up, grabbed her mug, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me alone with my doubts and the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the air. The weeks that followed were torturous. On the surface, life went on as usual. We went to Emily's soccer games, had dinner as a family, and exchanged the usual pleasantries about our days. But underneath it all, there was a tension that neither of us addressed. I tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong, but every time her phone buzzed or she came home later than expected, the doubts came rushing back. One evening, as she stood by the kitchen counter texting someone, I asked casually, "Is that Mark?" She looked up, startled, then rolled her eyes. "For the last time, Mark is just a coworker. Can we please drop this?" I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, I felt like I was drowning. The reassurance she gave me only made the doubts grow louder. A few weeks later, I decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I needed answers, not just words, but proof. So when she told me one evening that she had to work late, I didn't stay home waiting for her. Instead, I grabbed my jacket, got into my car, and parked near her office building, my heart pounding in my chest. First, nothing happened. The lights in her office were still on, and I saw a few employees leaving for the night. I was beginning to think I was overreacting, that maybe she really was just working late, when I saw her walk out of the building. She wasn't alone. A man I didn't recognize was walking beside her. He was tall, well-dressed, and clearly comfortable in her presence. As they reached the curb, he said something that made her laugh. A laugh I hadn't heard in months. My hands tightened around the steering wheel as I watched them. They didn't get into separate cars or even stop to say goodbye. Instead, they walked down the street together, eventually stopping in front of an upscale restaurant. He opened the door for her, and they both disappeared inside. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. This wasn't a late meeting. This wasn't a business project. They were on a date. No matter how much she would try to spin it later, that's what it was. When I got home, I couldn't hold it in any longer. She walked through the door a couple of hours later, her cheeks slightly flushed, her hair tousled in a way that suggested she'd been having a good time. "How was your meeting?" I asked, my voice dripping with sarcasm. She froze, her smile faltering. "What's that supposed to mean?" I stood up from the couch, unable to contain my frustration any longer. "Don't play dumb, Sarah. I saw you. I saw you with him. At the restaurant." Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might actually tell me the truth. But then she crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "I don't know what you think you saw, but it's not what you think," she said defensively. "That was Mark, and we were having a business dinner. My boss wanted me to entertain him so we could close a deal." "A business dinner?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Sarah, you were laughing with him like he was your boyfriend. Do you really expect me to believe that this was all for work?" "Yes, I do," she snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. My boss asked me to do this, and I did it for us, for our family. Do you think I enjoy spending my evening with some arrogant client? This is what it takes to get ahead." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the image of her laughing with Mark outside that restaurant was burned into my mind. "I don't know, Sarah," I said quietly. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore." She stared at me for a long moment, her jaw clenched, before finally turning away. "Believe what you want," she said over her shoulder as she walked upstairs. "I don't have time to convince you every time you get jealous." And just like that, the cracks in our marriage widened, the pieces of our life together slipping further out of reach. Despite my anger, despite the pit in my stomach that told me her explanation didn't add up, I convinced myself to believe her. I told myself she was telling the truth, that her dinner with Mark really was just business. Maybe I was overthinking things, letting my insecurities cloud my judgment. Maybe I was turning into one of those paranoid husbands you see in movies. Desperate, irrational. I hated the thought of being that guy. But trust, once broken, doesn't heal overnight. The doubts lingered, creeping into my mind when I least expected them. I couldn't shake the image of her with Mark, laughing and carefree, as if they were the only two people in the world. Every time she left for work, every time her phone buzzed with a message she didn't share, the doubts gnawed at me a little more. I needed peace of mind. I needed to know for sure one way or another. And so, one afternoon when Sarah was out running errands, I did something I never thought I'd do. I installed a GPS tracker in her car. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. My hands shook as I placed the device under the driver's seat, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I felt a sick sort of shame, a voice in my head telling me I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But another voice, louder and more insistent, reminded me that this was for my sanity. I wasn't doing this to hurt her. I was doing it to protect myself, to find the truth I couldn't seem to get from her. For the next month, that tracker became both my lifeline and my tormentor. Every time she left the house, I'd pull up the app on my phone and watch her little blue move across the map. Most of the time, her routes were exactly what she said they'd be. Home to work, work to the gym, the occasional stop at the grocery store. For a while, I almost felt guilty for doubting her. Maybe I really was overreacting. But then there were the moments that set my heart racing. Once, on a Wednesday evening, she told me she was heading to a late meeting at the office. Her dot, however, didn't stop at her office building. It hovered for a while in a strip mall parking lot, then moved to a park about 10 minutes away. She stayed there for nearly 2 hours. When she got home later that night, I asked her casually how her meeting had gone. "Boring," she said with a laugh, kicking off her heels. "You know how these things are." I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, my suspicions burned hotter than ever. Another time, she left the house on a Saturday afternoon, saying she needed to pick up some supplies for a project Emily was working on. Her car stopped at a coffee shop downtown and stayed there for almost an hour. When she came home, she was empty-handed. "Where's the stuff for Emily's project?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Oh, they didn't have what I needed," she said quickly. brushing past me to drop her purse on the kitchen counter. "I'll check another store tomorrow." It was a small inconsistency, but it stuck with me. How many little lies had she told me over the years that I'd been too blind to notice? As the weeks went on, I became obsessed with the tracker. I'd check it first thing in the morning, throughout the day, and again before bed. Every trip she made, every deviation from her usual routes, was like a puzzle piece I couldn't quite fit into place. She started to notice my unease. "You've been acting strange lately?" she said one evening as we sat on the couch watching TV. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah," I said quickly, avoiding her gaze. "Just stressed about work." She gave me a look, one of those searching glances she used to give me when she knew I was hiding something. But instead of pressing the issue, she just shrugged and turned back to the TV. The worst part was how normal everything seemed on the surface. We still had dinner as a family, still cheered for Emily at her soccer games, still made small talk about our days. But beneath it all, I felt like I was living with a stranger. And then, one day, the tracker gave me something I couldn't ignore. It was a Friday, and Sarah had told me she'd be staying late at the office to prepare for an upcoming presentation. Her dot, however, didn't go anywhere near her office. It went to a residential neighborhood I didn't recognize, stopping in front of a modest brick house. She stayed there for over 3 hours. I stared at the screen, my mind racing with possibilities. Was this Mark's house? A friend's? A client's? There was no way to know for sure, but my gut told me this wasn't business. When she got home that night, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I needed more. I needed proof. Over the next week, I became more meticulous. Every trip she made, every stop she took, I logged it in a notebook. Most of her movements were innocent, mundane. But every now and then, there'd be another trip to that same neighborhood, that same house. The more I watched, the more the doubts consumed me. I didn't know what I'd find, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep living like this. Whatever was happening, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. For a while, things between us started to feel normal again. It wasn't a sudden shift, more like the slow thawing of ice after a long winter. Sarah seemed to notice that something had been off between us, and to my surprise, she made an effort to bridge the gap. She started coming home earlier, and instead of retreating to her phone or her work, she'd join Emily and me for dinner at the table. We'd laugh at Emily's stories from school, talk about what we might do on the weekend, and for a moment, I could almost believe we were a regular, happy family again. She even planned a small family outing one Saturday, a picnic at the park. It had been months since we'd done anything like that. Sarah packed sandwiches and snacks while I loaded the car, and for a few hours we sat in the sunshine, tossing a frisbee with Emily and Max watching her laugh as she chased Emily around. I felt a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. "See, wasn't this better than a lazy Saturday at home?" she teased as we packed up the picnic. I smiled, nodding. Yeah, it was. And it was. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was standing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. At night, things began to shift too. She started sitting closer to me on the couch, resting her head on my shoulder as we watched TV. One evening, she surprised me by making my favorite dessert, chocolate mousse. It was little things like that, small gestures that reminded me of the early days of our relationship, back when everything felt simple and easy. "You've been working so hard lately," she said as she set the mousse in front of me. "I just thought you deserved something nice." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to believe her, to trust that this was her way of trying to reconnect. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe those trips to the residential neighborhood weren't what I thought they were. The tracker stayed in her car, but for the first time since I installed it, I started to forget about it. Days would go by without me checking her movements. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had to let go of my suspicions if I wanted to save our marriage. She'd been making an effort, and so should I. There were even moments when I felt foolish for doubting her at all. One afternoon, I scrolled back through her recent routes, and everything was exactly where she'd said it would be. Work, the gym, a quick stop at the store. Nothing unusual. The little blue dot on the app that had once consumed my every thought now felt more like a safety net. Something I didn't need unless I felt that pit in my stomach again. One evening, as we sat on the couch after Emily had gone to bed, Sarah turned to me with a soft smile. "I feel like we've been reconnecting lately," she said. "Don't you?" Her words caught me off guard. I hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "Yeah," I said finally. "It's been nice." She reached for my hand, lacing her fingers through mine. "I know things have been tough lately," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I really want us to be okay. I miss how we used to be." Hearing her say that made something in my chest ache. For all the doubts and fears I'd carried, there was still a part of me that desperately wanted to believe her, to believe that we could go back to how things were before the late nights and the messages and the lies. "I missed that too," I admitted. Her smile widened, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't a hurried kiss, or a kiss out of obligation. It was soft, warm, and filled with a tenderness that made me feel like maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. Over the next few weeks, the changes continued. She started texting me during the day, little messages like, "Thinking of you," or sending photos of something cute Emily had done. She even suggested we have a date night, a proper one like we used to. I jumped at the chance. That Friday, I took her to the Italian restaurant where we'd had our first real date. She wore a blue dress I hadn't seen in ages, and as we sat across from each other, laughing over shared appetizers, it almost felt like we were falling in love all over again. When we got home that night, she kissed me in the doorway, pulling me close like she hadn't in months. "Thank you for tonight," she whispered. "I needed this." "Me too," I said, holding her a little tighter. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. Maybe the worst was behind us. Maybe she really had just been stressed with work, and all those little signs I'd noticed were nothing more than coincidences. I stopped checking the tracker entirely. It wasn't a conscious decision, I just didn't feel the need anymore. Every time I saw her laughing with Emily or curling up next to me on the couch, it felt like we were finally finding our way back to each other. But in the back of my mind, the doubts never truly disappeared. They lingered, quiet and unspoken, like shadows in the corner of a room. I didn't know it yet, but those shadows were about to come rushing back, and this time, they'd be impossible to ignore. 2 months passed, and things between Sarah and me seemed better. Not perfect, but better. I hadn't looked at the tracker in weeks, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to believe we were rebuilding something solid. Then she told me about the trip to New York. It was a Sunday evening, and we were sitting in the living room after dinner. Emily was upstairs, immersed in some elaborate art project, and Max lay stretched out at our feet. Sarah turned to me with a hesitant smile, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "So, I need to tell you something," she began, her voice casual, but with that edge of formality she used when she was preparing to say something important. "What's up?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "My boss wants me to go to New York for a couple of days," she said, watching me carefully. "There's a big client meeting, and they think it'll help to have me there to present some of the marketing strategies we've been working on." I nodded slowly, processing her words. "When would you leave?" "Tuesday morning," she said. "It's just a short trip. I'll drive up, stay overnight, and come back Wednesday evening." I wanted to trust her. I really did. She'd been making such an effort lately, and I didn't want to ruin the progress we'd made by letting my old doubts resurface. "Okay," I said finally. "Do you need anything for the trip? I can help you get packed." Her smile widened, and she reached over to squeeze my hand. "Thank you for understanding. I promise it's nothing major, just work stuff." The next day, she started preparing for the trip. I watched from the doorway as she packed her overnight bag, carefully folding a couple of blouses and a pair of tailored pants. She seemed unusually cheerful, humming to herself as she worked. "What's got you in such a good mood?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. She glanced over her shoulder with a grin. "It's just nice to feel like I'm being trusted to represent the company. You know? It feels good to be taken seriously." I nodded, trying to push away the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Well, you deserve it. You've worked hard for this. She straightened up, closing her bag and turning to face me. I'll be back before you even have time to miss me, she teased, stepping closer and wrapping her arms around my waist. I'll hold you to that, I said, forcing a smile. On Tuesday morning, she was up before the sun, bustling around the house as she made coffee and packed a few snacks for the road. She kissed Emily goodbye before our daughter left for school, promising to bring her back a little souvenir from the city. Be good for Daddy, okay? She said, crouching down to give Emily a hug. I will, Emily said, smiling. Bring me something cool. Sarah laughed, ruffling her hair. You got it. As she grabbed her bag and keys, I followed her to the door, unable to shake the sense of unease that had settled in my chest. Drive safe, I said, pulling her into a hug. I will, she replied, her voice muffled against my shoulder. And call me when you get there, okay? Just so I know you're safe. Of course, she said, pulling back to look at me. Stop worrying so much. It's just a quick trip. I'll be back before you know it. I nodded, watching as she climbed into her car and started the engine. She waved as she backed out of the driveway, the early morning light catching the glint of her wedding ring. As her car disappeared down the street, I stood there for a moment longer, the knot in my stomach tightening despite her reassurances. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something about the way she'd smiled, the way her voice had been just a little too breezy, it made my doubts stir to life once again. Still, I shook it off and headed back inside. I had promised myself I'd trust her, and that's exactly what I intended to do, or so I thought. By mid-morning, she was already halfway to New York, or at least that's what I believed at the time. The next morning, I woke up early, not expecting anything unusual. I hadn't thought about the tracker since she left, but something nagged at me. A fleeting curiosity to check if she'd reached New York. It wasn't distrust, I told myself. It was just a quick look for peace of mind. I opened the app, expecting to see her car parked at a hotel or near her meeting location. But the blue dot wasn't anywhere near New York. It wasn't even in the city's direction. Instead, her car was in a rural area, near a stretch of forest about 30 minutes outside the city. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. Why would she be there? There was nothing in that area, no office buildings, no hotels, nothing remotely connected to work. A sinking feeling began to form in the pit of my stomach. I told myself it could be a mistake, that maybe she'd taken a wrong turn or stopped for gas. But the longer I stared at the dot, unmoving in the middle of nowhere, the more the doubts crept in. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and drove. The entire ride felt like a blur, the trees along the highway blending into a single smear of green as my thoughts spiraled. What could she possibly be doing there? Maybe it's innocent. But what if it's not? By the time I turned onto the dirt road leading to the location, my hands were trembling on the steering wheel. The road was quiet, lined with tall trees that seemed to close in around me. I drove slowly, my eyes darting to the GPS as I neared the spot where the tracker said her car was parked. And then I saw it. Her car was there, parked near a small clearing just off the road. At first, I didn't see anyone, and for a fleeting moment, I thought maybe I'd overreacted. But then I looked closer. In the clearing, leaning against the hood of her car, was Sarah. She wasn't alone. A man was with her, her boss, Mark. I recognized him immediately from the photos she'd shown me of her team. And they weren't just standing there. Sarah was sitting on the hood of her car, her legs draped over the edge, laughing softly as Mark stood between them. She wasn't wearing anything, and neither was he. Their bodies were close, tangled in a way that left no room for doubt about what was happening. It was like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. My heart pounded in my ears as I watched, frozen in place. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a coincidence. This wasn't business. They kissed, their laughter blending with the sound of rustling leaves. For a moment, I thought about turning around and leaving, sparing myself the agony of watching. But something inside me refused to move. I reached for my phone with shaking hands and started recording. I didn't know why, maybe for proof, maybe because I needed to capture the moment to convince myself it was real. Through the lens of the camera, I saw everything. The way she touched him, the way he whispered something in her ear that made her laugh again. It was all so intimate, so effortless, as if I didn't even exist. I don't remember how long I stood there, filming from the cover of the trees. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. My hands tightened around the phone. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference. And I turned and stormed back to my car, my mind racing with fury and betrayal. But before I left, I needed to do something. I grabbed the small utility knife from my glove compartment and marched back to her car. My movements were quick, almost mechanical. As I stabbed the knife into each of her tires, the sound of air hissing out punctuating the silence of the clearing. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure she couldn't leave before I did. I got back into my car and drove off, my chest heaving as the reality of what I just witnessed set in. When I got home, I didn't stop to think. I went straight to the bedroom and began packing her things, tossing clothes into suitcases without bothering to fold them. By the time I was done, there was a pile of her belongings stacked neatly by the front door. It was nearly midnight when I heard her key in the lock. She walked in, her face flushed, her hair disheveled, and froze when she saw the suitcases. "Care to explain where you were?" I asked, my voice cold and steady. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "I know everything," I said, pulling out my phone and playing the video. Her face went pale as she watched, her hands shaking as she reached for me. "Wait, please, let me explain," she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "No," I said firmly, stepping back. "There's nothing left to explain. Your things are outside. You don't live here anymore." For the first time, the reality of what she'd done seemed to hit her. She begged, pleaded, but I didn't listen. The door closed behind her, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to clarity. The life we'd built was gone, shattered by her choices. All that was left now was to pick up the pieces. I sat on the couch long after Sarah left, staring at the video on my phone. My mind raced with everything that had just happened. The betrayal, the lies, the years of trust shattered in an instant. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them in that clearing, their laughter ringing in my ears like a cruel taunt. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to do anything to rid myself of the weight crushing my chest. Instead, I stared at the video, the seconds ticking by as my anger morphed into something colder, sharper. She didn't just betray me, she humiliated me. She threw away everything we had, not just for some meaningless fling, but in a way that showed she didn't even care enough to hide it. I couldn't let her walk away from this unscathed. The next day, I made a decision. After dropping Emily off at school, I contacted a friend who worked at one of the local news stations. It wasn't a big network, just a small-town outlet that specialized in community stories and local gossip. I told them I had something they might want to see, something that would make headlines. "I've got video evidence of a high-profile affair involving a prominent local businessman," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "What kind of video?" my contact asked, their tone cautious. "The kind that'll get people talking," I replied. After some negotiation, I agreed to send them the footage under the condition that they blur out anything explicit and keep my name out of it. They agreed, sensing the scandal would be worth the effort. That afternoon, the story broke. The news segment started innocently enough, a brief introduction about local business ethics and the pressures of leadership. But then the anchor's tone shifted, and they announced they'd received anonymous footage of an inappropriate relationship between a well-known executive and a married employee. The video was heavily censored, the faces blurred and the audio muted, but the scene was unmistakable. Sarah and Mark, caught in their moment of betrayal, displayed on screens across the city. The fallout was immediate. By the end of the day, the news station's social media pages were flooded with comments. People speculated about the identities of the couple, dissecting every detail in the video. It didn't take long for someone to recognize Mark's car, which had been visible in the footage, or to connect the dots about Sarah. Her name began circulating online within hours. Mark's identity followed shortly after. At home, I watched the chaos unfold from a distance, my phone buzzing constantly with messages from friends and acquaintances. Some were supportive, expressing outrage on my behalf. Others were curious, fishing for details I wasn't willing to share. Meanwhile, Sarah's life began to unravel. She called me repeatedly, but I ignored every call. When the messages started coming in, I read them with detached indifference. "How could you do this to me? Please take the video down. I'll do anything. You've ruined my life." It was ironic, really, her begging me for mercy after everything she'd done. Mark wasn't spared either. His company issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions, and by the end of the week, he was placed on indefinite leave. Rumors swirled about him facing a possible lawsuit for inappropriate conduct with an employee. The community turned on both of them. Parents at Emily's school whispered about Sarah in the hallways. Clients began withdrawing their business from Mark's company. Even their so-called friends abandoned them, unwilling to be associated with such a public scandal. One evening, Sarah showed up at the house, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. She stood on the porch, clutching her phone, and begged me to let her in. "You've made your point," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, can we just talk? I've lost everything." I opened the door just enough to look her in the eye. "You did this to yourself, Sarah," I said coldly. "You had a choice and you chose to destroy everything we had. Now you have to live with it." Her tears flowed freely, but I didn't feel sympathy. Not anymore. I closed the door, locking it behind me, and walked away without a second glance. In the days that followed, the noise began to quiet. The story faded from the news, replaced by the next scandal, the next tragedy. But for Sarah and Mark, the damage was done. She moved in with a distant relative, unable to face the judgment of the community. Mark disappeared from public life altogether, his career in ruins. As for me, I focused on Emily. I threw myself into being the best father I could be, determined to shield her from the worst of the fallout. Every day, I told myself I was moving forward, one step at a time. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the memories crept back in, I wondered if I'd ever truly escape the shadow of what had happened. The weeks following the scandal felt like living in a strange, new world. The life I had known, the life we had built together, was gone, replaced by something raw and unfamiliar. Sarah's betrayal had left its mark, but as the dust began to settle, I found myself confronting a choice. Would I let this define me, or would I find a way to move forward? Sarah tried to reach out a few more times after I sent her away, but I kept my distance. Every message, every voicemail, felt like a feeble attempt to rewrite history, to paint herself as a victim. "I made a mistake," she wrote once. "Please, can we fix this? For Emily's sake." But there was no fixing this. Trust wasn't something you could patch up with apologies, especially when it had been shattered so completely. Still, as much as I wanted to cut her out of my life entirely, Emily complicated things. Sarah was her mother, and no matter how angry I was, I couldn't take that away from her. So we worked out a visitation schedule through my lawyer, strict and formal. Sarah would see Emily on weekends under clear conditions. No surprises, no drama. One Saturday, when Sarah came to pick up Emily, she lingered on the porch. She looked different, tired, thinner, like the weight of everything had finally caught up with her. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "What do you want, Sarah?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost believed the sincerity in her voice. "I just want to say I'm sorry for everything. I didn't mean to hurt you or Emily or anyone. I don't even know who I was back then." I crossed my arms, keeping my face neutral. "You had a choice, Sarah, and you made it." "I know," she said, her voice cracking, "and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I wanted you to know that." For the first time since everything had happened, I felt something other than anger. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something quieter. A recognition that she was human, flawed and broken, and that holding on to my rage would only hurt me in the end. "I hear you," I said finally. But this doesn't change anything. We'll co-parent for Emily, and that's it. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, before turning and walking away. In the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life. I poured my energy into my work, picking up projects I'd been neglecting. I spent more time with Emily, making sure she felt safe and loved despite everything that had happened. I started going to therapy, a step I'd resisted for a long time. It wasn't easy, unpacking the weight of betrayal and figuring out how to move forward. But slowly, I began to feel lighter. My therapist helped me see that my worth wasn't tied to Sarah's choices, that I could still build a good life for myself and for Emily. As for Sarah, her life didn't bounce back as easily. The scandal had cost her more than just her marriage. She lost her job, her reputation, and the respect of many in the community. Mark, her former boss and partner in betrayal, had left the company and moved out of state, leaving her to pick up the pieces alone. Emily talked about her mom sometimes, asking questions I didn't always have the answers to. "Why doesn't Mommy live with us anymore?" she asked one night as I tucked her into bed. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Mommy made some mistakes, sweetie, but she loves you very much, and that's what matters." Emily nodded, her small brow furrowed in thought. "Do you still love her?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I loved her once," I said honestly. "But sometimes love isn't enough to make things okay. What's important is that you're loved by both of us, and we'll always take care of you." She seemed satisfied with that answer, curling up with her stuffed animal and closing her eyes. 1 year later, I stood in the same house that had once felt like a prison of memories, but now it felt different. Emily's laughter filled the air as she played with Max in the backyard. The walls were still the same, the furniture hadn't changed, but it no longer felt like the place where everything fell apart. Felt like home again. I wasn't the same person I had been before Sarah's betrayal. I was stronger, more aware of my own worth. The wounds she left behind hadn't fully healed, but they no longer defined me. I realized that life doesn't end when someone breaks your heart. It just shifts, giving you the chance to rebuild something new. And that's exactly what I plan to do. Support the channel by subscribing. It really makes a difference.